Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to day 3 in palette week, where every single day for 7 days straight I'm posting some sort of palette themed content. And today I have essentially like a part 2 to yesterday's video, which yesterday's video was 20 best eyeshadow palettes from 20 different brands in under 20 minutes. And today we're going to be talking about 20 worst eyeshadow palettes from 20 different brands. Fingers crossed, hopefully in under 20 minutes. And I will say I did really struggle with putting together this list because there's so many eyeshadow palettes that like weren't favorites maybe, but like aren't like the worst, like aren't terrible quality. But I really tried to just think through every single palette that I've ever tried from each of the 20 brands that I'm going to talk about today, and really thought through like which of all the palettes that I've tried were the worst quality, that I didn't like the best, and things like that. So that's where this list was born. If you guys are interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I'd love for you to consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's get into the video. All right, you guys, before we begin, I would love you to leave your comments down below about some of the worst palettes that you feel like you've ever tried, because I know you guys are gonna leave the best comments and I'm just so excited to read all of them. The majority of these palettes I no longer have in my collection, so I'm actually just gonna scoot to the side so that I can insert photos. Again, if these palettes worked for you, if any of these palettes worked for you and you loved them, that makes me so happy, because that means you did not waste your money on eyeshadow palettes that you purchased. I will also say, when I started to create this list, I was like, ooh, maybe I should only talk about palettes that like are still available. But actually there's quite a few on this list that like are no longer available, but I don't even know if I would have been able to I don't think I would have been able to do it if I could only talk about palettes that were only still available. Anyway, all right guys, we are gonna kick it off with none other than my girl Natasha, and she's had some not great palettes release in my opinion, but she also has some palettes that are just incredible. And I've gotten to the point where I really do just like collect her palettes at this point in time. I will say some of my worst experiences with her palettes has come from the large $129 palettes. I thought about selecting Circo Loco because that one's still available. I just had really bad like creasing issues with that palette. But ultimately I landed on the Natasha Denona Safari palette. I will say, a part of me wishes, the collector in me wishes that I had kept both the Safari and the Circo Loco palette just so I could still have them in my collection, but I don't have them anymore. I don't have them. I decluttered them. And the Safari palette was an all matte palette, which I will say all matte is definitely not my preference. I definitely like to have a shimmer on the lid, literally no matter what. It's funny, I'll do a matte look or I'll see an all matte look on someone else and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so pretty. And I also feel like I have dry, saggy skin, so like an all matte look might actually look better on my eyelids, but I like me some shimmer, I like me some sparkle in my life. Okay, I just had to take a work call, so now I've like completely lost what I was talking about. We were talking about Natasha Denona Safari. Oh, this was an all matte palette, and I just felt like all of the shades muddied together and like I just couldn't get a good blend. This was very early on in my early stages of like playing around with makeup, but if I'm remembering correctly, I feel like I was searching reviews and I feel like Mel Thompson had the same issues with her Safari palette. And so I was like, okay, maybe it isn't just me, which is such a bummer because there were some shades that I really loved. There was like a dusty pink mauve in that palette that was like my perfect dusty pink. I'm curious if that's the one that's also in the retro, like the mini retro palette, mini retro glam. I'm not sure. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, but that palette just really didn't work for me. None of the shades looked good, or like, unless I was just doing like one shadow in the crease, I don't feel like these blended well together at all. And when you are paying $129 for an eyeshadow palette, like you should not have those issues. So for me, it was the Natasha Denona Safari. Also, I'm just shout out Circo Loco, not the best. And then I've also had issues with my Zendo palette as well. Moving on to Huda Beauty. So first on my list, like when I was first making this list, I wanted to mention the Huda gemstone line, and I couldn't decide between the amethyst or the green palette. I can't remember, was the green the emerald? So I was thinking through that, and then I was looking at like old declutters of mine, and I forgot that I owned the Desert Dusk palette, and that was just not a good palette, like at all. And I did purchase mine much later after it released, so I don't know if I purchased a palette that was just old or if it was truly just like not good quality, because the last 4 large palettes Huda's released, which by the way, who's so excited to see what she's gonna release this year. She better, I mean, she always does this time of year, right? I'm super excited to see what the color story is gonna be. The Desert Dusk just, I mean, oh, another work call. Okay, geez Louise, here we are back, another work call. Okay, Desert Dusk, it was dry, it was chalky, it didn't blend well together. In theory, like the color story was beautiful. I remember there was that super scratchy, just not good quality, like pressed glitter in there as well. Huda Beauty's come a long way. It's come a long way, but the Desert Dusk, in my opinion, was the worst. There have been some pretty not great Obsessions palettes sprinkled along the way too. I'm thinking of the Gemstone collection. I'm also thinking of the Haze collection, just not the best. Okay, you guys, then I have Nomad Cosmetics, and for me, so I've only tried 3 Nomad palettes. I have the Nomad Ghost Town as well as the Okavango palette, and those are my 2 newest to my collection. They're very new to my collection, and I will say I do find that Nomad's matte formula specifically feels like pretty dry when you're like swatching it, but I've had good luck with the last 2 palettes I've tried. I did not have great luck with the Fire and Ice palette. And for me, it wasn't so much like the blending or the feel of the shadows. It was just that the shadows did not last very long on my eyes. I found that they creased some, and then really the metallic shades started to like wear off my eyes pretty quickly. And so for me, it was the Nomad Fire and Ice palette. Okay, you guys, we are literally getting nowhere. I'm getting so many things from work. Okay, next up, Melt Cosmetics. Now, Melt already has a formula that I feel like is a little bit more difficult to work with, takes a little bit more finessing, takes a little bit more time. But for me, when I think of the worst / most difficult Melt palette that I've tried, it has to be the Mary Jane, because that palette has so much fallout and it just takes so much time and so much patience. But I'm telling you, you always get a beautiful look when using that palette. It's always so beautiful. So it's really hard for me to like say that palette, but really it's a really difficult palette to work with. So for me, Melt, it's got to be the Mary Jane palette. For Anastasia Beverly Hills, I was going between, my first thought was Subculture, and then I was like, I feel like eh. And then I was like, ooh, what about the Riviera palette? And I was like, I actually liked the Riviera palette. Then I was like, maybe the Carly Bible palette, but the quality of that was good. I just was like bored by the color story. And then I remembered, oh my gosh, another phone call. Then I remember the ABH Prism palette. Okay, as I was saying, the ABH Prism palette, I just felt like the color story of this was kind of like thrown together. It didn't make sense to me. And then there were some shades that worked really well, but some shades that didn't. I'm thinking specifically of the shade Cube, which was like a really beautiful like holographic purple, but like in practice, it was more of like a sheen sheer sort of shade and just wasn't as intense on the eyes, which isn't the biggest deal. But I feel like normally ABH has like these really intense shades, so it was just kind of like a surprise. I feel like now I need like more lip gloss. I do like the way this gloss is looking on the lips today. Anyway, ABH Prism, in my opinion, worst I've tried from ABH. Next up, for Tarte, I was like, I don't think I have a worse palette from Tarte, but then I remembered, for me, my experience with the Tartelette Toasted palette just did not go well. I was really excited for the Tartelette Toasted palette. It was in the craze of like these warm eyeshadow color stories, and I loved my Tartelette in Bloom, so I was like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna love Tartelette Toasted even more. And I remember just not having the best luck with my shades blending. I feel like they were a little bit patchy. It just wasn't the same experience that I personally had with the Tartelette in Bloom. So for me personally, the Tartelette Toasted palette is the worst Tarte palette I've tried. It's not a bad palette. It just was not up to like what I was expecting it was gonna be. Next up, for Oden's Eye. You guys know Oden's Eye makes one of my absolute favorite color stories of, or not color stories, eyeshadow formulas and color stories of literal all time. I would say they might have my top eyeshadow formula. That and like Glam Light I think have just an incredible eyeshadow formula. So it was really difficult for me to decide, and I thought maybe I would go with their original Solmani. By the way, why am I rambling on when I only have 20 minutes to talk to you guys about this? Am I like going on about other palettes within the same brand? But ultimately I landed on Oden's Eyes Saga Fria. This just was, why did I buy this? It wasn't an inspiring color story. The shades that I thought were gonna be super intense or special in the eyes just weren't. The quality of the mattes was totally fine, blended well together, but overall I was just uninspired by the color story. It was a thicker package for what it was, and I just was like, you know what? In my opinion, this is the worst I've tried from Oden's Eye. Then I have Juvia's Place, and for me, I've never been one to be super inspired by Juvia's formula. I've never thought they have the best eyeshadow formula. I've really struggled to work with it at times. Ultimately, and I could be like, I feel like I've had other Juvia's palettes that I haven't loved either. But what stuck out in my mind was the Juvia's Warrior palette. And don't get me wrong, I loved that center metallic shade. I thought it was so beautiful. But this is another one where I felt like if I was doing more than like 2 shadows from this palette, I did not feel like the shadows blended well together. I felt like they muddied, and I just did not have the best luck with the quality of the Juvia's Place Warrior palette. So that would be my worst from Juvia's. Okay, you guys, for Lawless, I have decluttered this palette, but I have been so bad about trying to like list things on my Poshmark and stuff this year, or Mercari, whatever it is, that I still have it sitting in my collection. So I figured I'd show this one. For Lawless, I was going between the one eyeshadow palette, which I didn't have good luck with, but more of the one shadows worked for me than this palette right here. This is the Lawless, the lavender one. I was so disappointed in this palette. Part of it, I was really excited for this palette, but then like this shade might be one of the worst eyeshadows I've ever worked with across any palette ever. One of the worst shadows, so patchy, so dry, doesn't blend, like crease, it's just not good. And then even like some of the other matte shades in this palette, I just didn't feel like were great. Wasn't super impressed by either of these 2 metallic shades. Was it? No, maybe it wasn't impressed by this one, and then one of these 2. I can't even remember at this point. I think this one I wasn't super impressed with. So, really most of the shades in this palette were duds, and when you're talking about only 8 eyeshadows and like over half of them just weren't great in my opinion, I was really let down by that palette. Next up from Urban Decay, it has to be the Wild Greens for me. I was again so excited for this palette, and just dry, dusty, so much kick up, no pigmentation on the eyes. Super sheer shimmers. Just not a good palette. Like I don't even really have words. It just wasn't good. And I was so disappointed in it. Then from Nabla Cosmetics, I went with the Poison Garden palette. I remember I had purchased the Nabla Secret palette, absolutely loved it, and then I purchased Poison Garden thinking I was going to absolutely love that palette as well. And while I had fun with it, I just felt like the color story felt a little bit discombobulated, and the quality wasn't as good as the Secret palette. So overall, I just definitely could do without the Nabla Poison Garden. All right, another palette I actually own from Nars. I have the Nars Climax here. This palette, I really love the 4 metallic shades in this palette. Did not have the best luck with the matte shades. Even like the matte shades that I feel like should blend well together, I just found them to be a little bit muddy. Now I am obviously gonna pull this palette back out this winter and play around with it again. So we'll see if I still have the same experience. Even the satin taupe shade, I really do enjoy. So there's definitely shades within this palette that I really like, but I just really struggled with the mattes in this palette. So I had to go with this one as my worst from Nars. Everything from Nars is limited edition, so you can't get this anymore anyway, but I'm a little bit leery of like darker mattes from Nars based on my experience with that, but like overall my experience with Nars has been really good with their eyeshadow. From Pat McGrath, I have tried quite a bit from Pat McGrath. I think the worst that I've tried, and it's not bad, but just the Rose Decadence palette. I didn't absolutely love the way that the mattes blended well. I don't think Pat McGrath has the best matte formula, to be honest. I had a pan in this palette when I declutter it, so obviously like I still enjoyed using the palette. And I thought about choosing the other 6 pan I have from Pat McGrath, the Subliminal, this one right here. But I do actually really like that one for actually the matte brown shades and all shimmers but the blue one. So I decided to go with Rose Seconds because it felt more right. Next up from Artist Couture, the Supreme Mauve palette was just not good at all. Again, I was so excited for this palette. It released in like the peak of like the mauve tone rose palette craze, and I was like, Artist Couture makes one of my favorite eyeshadow formulas. I love his sleek packaging, and this was just not good. The mattes did not blend well together, and I was not impressed by the metallic shimmer formula either. Just not good in my opinion. So for Artist Couture, it's got to be Supreme Mauves. Colourpop, I've tried so many Colourpop palettes in my day that like I'm sure I'm forgetting something that maybe was worse that I have tried in the past, but the one that came to mind was the Colourpop the Wild One palette, because it was a mostly neutral palette, and I just felt like this was like a lazily done palette from Colourpop in terms of the quality of the eyeshadow. The blue brown shade was absolute trash. I don't even remember, I must have tried the hot pink shade, which I don't even remember like how I felt about it, but there were browns in that palette that I just didn't feel like blended well, and I was like, what? A brown not blending well? Like, this is just unacceptable. So for Colourpop, it was the Wild One palette. From Dominique Cosmetics, Rustic Glam. This palette I wanted to love so much. I loved the outer packaging, I loved the green shade in the palette, and I wanted to love the palette as a whole, but it just missed in terms of the quality of some of the other shades, some of the deeper, darker shades. It just didn't work for me. I wanted to love that palette so badly. From Glamlight, I really have not tried anything I don't like from Glamlight, but if I had to choose the worst palette, I would either go with the Glamlight Donut. I went with Glamlight Donut just because the color story is a little bit brighter, so I would get less use out of it, or the Glamlight Cherry Pie. And part of it is just like the annoying, like the round, on top of the round packaging, it had like the raised, it just super annoying to store, as is many of their other palettes, but the round packaging I just didn't want to deal with. So, and I also feel like they had a good formula back then, but it's come even farther in terms of just being such a great formula. So that's my answer for Glamlight. And then for Sigma, I went with the Sigma Untamed palette. I was kind of between Sigma Warm Neutrals and Sigma Untamed, but I've struggled with Sigma Untamed. In general, I personally don't love Sigma's eyeshadow formula as a whole. I still have a couple palettes from them that I really do love using, but I don't think they have the best matte formula, and I also think their metallic, like cream form, like their metallics can be really hit or miss. Some of them are more of like a creamy formula, some of them work really well, some of them I don't think work that great. So I'm always a little bit hesitant to buy Sigma eyeshadows just because I've like had a hit or miss experience with them. I want to love their formula so much because some of my favorite creators really love Sigma, and I just have not always had the best experience. It's definitely a formula I can work with, but it's just not the best. From Dose of Colors, I totally forgot about this palette, but I was going back to like my ranking of way back when. The Dose of Colors Snow Angels palette. I shouldn't have even purchased this because at the time I definitely wasn't using colors like this, but I just didn't feel like these colors worked well to create a look, and you only have 5 shades and it's like this pink and this blue. It just didn't work for me. I really enjoyed a lot of their other 5-pan palettes, especially at that time, but I felt like the quality was lacking in the Snow Angels palette. And then I was really struggling to find a 20th brand to talk about, and I actually don't own any of these palettes. I've only tried 3 and I returned all 3, and I normally this was also way back in the day. I can't remember the last time I returned makeup. It was so bad I returned these. I bought them in a set, and it was the Smashbox Cover Shop palettes. Terrible. And you can still get these, which is why I want to talk about them, why I want to mention them. I don't know if their formula has improved or what, but terrible. Like, so dry, would not even show up on your eyelids. So bad. Let me know if you guys have ever tried a I almost said cover box again. A Smashbox Cover Shop palette that has worked for you. I would love to know, personally. Let me know. But you guys, that is gonna wrap it up for today's video. My 20 worst eyeshadow palettes from 20 different brands. hopefully in under 20 minutes. I'm not sure how it's gonna work out with all the work calls that I had to put. I don't know where we're at for time, but that is it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch and for supporting me as you guys always do. I appreciate you guys more than you know. Let me know what other palette themed content you would like to see from me. I do still have one full palette week that will be coming at the end of the year, and then I am going to try and post at least one palette themed video every week. So let me know. I would love to know if you guys would see, like, would you guys on my channel want to see like dedicated reviews to new palette releases, like just on one palette? Let me know if that's something you're interested in or not. I've just been trying to think about how I can incorporate even more palette content onto my channel. But that's it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in tomorrow's video. Bye.